Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming. I want to say that at such moments I'm especially pleased to stand here, because I'm in two capacities. On the one hand, as the host and the owner of this place, on the other hand, as the publisher and as a friend. As a friend, yes, that's the most pleasant. I want to say about this book by Mikhail Trofimenkov. Let's welcome him. And congratulate him on its release. I can safely say that this is the opus magnum of Misha's work. Here, I honestly and responsibly declare that this is one of the best books written in Russian in the last 20 years, if not more, about cinema. It is called Cinema of Military Actions. Hello, Cinema of Military Actions. Actually, I had a better title, Episodes of the Revolutionary War, but it turned out that Che Guevara had already used it, beating me to it. So, Cinema of Military Actions. First of all, I want to say that I consider my co-author of this book, the wonderful book artist, Pyotr Reznikov. Thanks to Pyotr, I saw a significant part of my characters in person for the first time. Because I couldn't get to these photographs anywhere, but he did. And I also had a wonderful editor, Alexei Belozerov, who has now left for Africa. As Konstantin Shavlovsky says, apparently after reading about the events in Algeria, Congo, Guinea and Senegal, which I wrote about among other things. There is also something about Ukraine here. How can I relate to a book that looks like this? And that surprises me. Did I really write all these letters myself? Where the action takes place, although documentary, but in its content it's probably worthy of a noir, a revolutionary epic and a western. The action takes place on all continents, from Canada, where armored vehicles enter Montreal in 1970, and the army arrests 500 Canadian intellectuals, including all of Canadian cinema, on charges of collaborating with terrorists, to Japan, where the wonderful director Kozu Wakamatsu worked, who died 2 years ago, and whose film Ecstasy of the Angels you will see today after my brief introduction, and Masaya Adachi, who participated in the activities of Nihon Sekegon, the Japanese Red Army. Both of these directors left for Palestine, where Adachi disappeared for 21 years, missing in action, because he became a press attaché and full-time field director for the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. From Congo to Germany, in general, the coverage is truly colossal. I will approach this book as a kind of sketch of several chapters of a political history of cinema that has not yet been written. There are many histories of cinema as an industry and/or business, but there is no political history of cinema. There are books about individual episodes of the interaction between cinema and politics. For example, about the times of the occupation of France, or about Nazi propaganda, a little about the revolutionary cinema of Latin America, but there is no general political history of cinema. Also, cinema is, first and foremost, the art of the era of imperialism, and this means art from the time of the war, which began in 1898, when, according to Lenin's formula, capitalism entered its highest imperialist stage. It started on the outskirts, in Cuba, in the Philippines. In 1914 it matured to the stage of the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the century, the First World War. Then it continued from the 18th to the 39th in the form of a global civil war, the War of the Comintern, or the War of the Red and Black Internationals. Then it escalated again to the stage known as World War II, and then, which is is what my book is actually about. It moved into a new world civil, national liberation war. The book covers the period from 54 to about the end of the 70s. The prologue is very romantic. I chose this episode, May 54. A lot of things happened this month that were fateful, excuse the stupid word, for the world. But this year, in May 1954, the French fortress of Dien Bien Phu fell. What did France's defeat in the colonial war in Vietnam mean? And this was a precedent. For the first time in history, a conquered, colonized people forced the colonizers to go home by force of arms. And on May 24, 1954, Roman Carmen's film crew crossed the Chinese-Vietnamese border. They're going to Vietnam. They're going in the literal sense of the word, because they have to follow the Ho Chi Minh Trail, because the war is still going on. They're still bombing. These were the first Soviet people in Vietnam. There weren't even any military advisors then. There was no one, no diplomats, because the Democratic Republic of Vietnam existed in guerrilla areas. There were 2 Soviet military operators in Carmen's group. They were late for the fall of Dien Bien Phu, but they arrived at Dien Bien Phu just as the Vietnamese, or Viet Minh, as Ho Chi Minh's fighters were called, were driving 12,000 French prisoners north into the guerrilla areas. 4,000 people will return from captivity. 8,000 people will die, not because the Vietnamese killed prisoners, but because of the climate, the march through the jungle, and the French bombs. In general, most will die. Roman Carmen learns that among the French prisoners, one of the Vietnamese officers tells him this: "There is your colleague, there is an operator." The French army had, and still has, an amazing, best and the oldest photocinema series in the world. There was a large group of cameramen in Dien Bien Phu. One died as soon as he landed with a parachute in Dien Bien Phu. The second had his leg torn off and was evacuated. The third died in hand-to-hand combat. The fourth went missing while escaping from captivity on the march. So, there was one operator left, and Roman Carmen took him to his stand. He saved his life, told the Vietnamese that he was taking several people whom he wanted to film, whom he wanted to interview for his film Indochine. 2 of these 3 people were not in danger, because the Vietnamese took away the top command staff in trucks. It was the commander of the French troops and the famous paratrooper commander Maurice Béjart, and Carmen simply saved the sword of these 3 people. He didn't film his for his movie. He told about him in the first edition of his memoirs in 1962, but he clearly made up the conversations that took place between them, because this man himself, saved by Roman Carmen, says that Carmen was amazing. He didn't agitate me for communism, he didn't want to find out anything from me, he told me about Spain, about Robert Capa, about Hemingway, about André Malraux, about the Cannes Film Festival, and when it was time for me to go back to the prisoner of war camp, he patted me on the shoulder and said, "Don't worry, everything will be fine. Let's bet that you and I will soon be drinking vodka at Moscow Film Festival and champagne at Cannes." And so it turned out, because this military cameraman saved by Roman Carmen became the great French film director Pierre Schondorfer, a nightingale of French general staff, as they would say in the USSR, but the author of amazing films about colonial wars, about lost soldiers. The 317th Platoon, A Captain's Honor, Dien Bien Phu, and perhaps in memory of that meeting with Roman Carmen, whom he always, in all his interviews and memoirs, recalled with great gratitude, he introduced into his film Dien Bien Phu a character, a French pilot who desperately flies, dropping cargo to the besieged garrison. And this man has a gold star of the hero of the Soviet Union on his chest, because he fought in the Normandy Niemann A Regiment. This is one of 1,000 episodes of the World Revolutionary War, which is discussed in this book. I would say that this book is not so much about cinema as it is about the people of cinema. It is a story of civil and moral passion, civil and moral rage, which led people into the urban armed underground, into guerrilla armies that killed people. Here we are talking about several national cinemas that almost completely perished in this war. This is how Chilean cinema perished under Pinochet, because its most prominent leaders were brutally murdered. All other cinema emigrated and, let's say, during the first 15 years of Pinochet's dictatorship in Chile, 2 full-length films were released. A third would have been released, but most of the film crew was seized by local state security agents immediately after the pre-premiere screening. They all disappeared without a trace. That's how Chilean cinema died. I'm writing about how Indonesian cinema died, at least a significant part of it, during the massacre of communists that took place in Indonesia in '65. I'm writing about how Argentine cinema perished during the Dirty War in the '70s. That is, it is true, as Godard said about his unfinished film Until Victory, which he shot in the Palestinian camps in 1970, he could not finish this film because all the heroes of this film are dead. So a significant part of the heroes of this book are also dead, because this book is about the period called lead time, lead years in this world civil war. So this book is not about cinema, which reflects some historical events, not a book about cinema, which understands these events, not a book about cinema, which is dedicated to these events, but a book about cinema, which in itself is this event, about cinema-war, about cinema-revolution. It so happened, it is an objective reality, that the overwhelming majority of the heroes of this book, to whom I pay special attention, the bravest and most talented heroes of this book, it so happened that they are communists. This does not mean that they were all members of official communist parties that supported the Moscow line. To a large extent, they were communist dissidents. They could have been people who left the Communist Party in protest against the suppression in Hungary in 1956 of what they thought was a popular uprising, but was in fact just a fascist rebellion. But at the same time they retained communist convictions. They could have been Trotskyists, they could have been anarcho-communists, who for the first time in history in 1913, a year before the First World War, created and developed a successful experience of cinema, filmed politically. In fact, the joint history of politics and cinema is a history from the very moment cinema appeared, because cinema was born in 1895, then cinema became available to viewers, and in 1898 propaganda was born, because the United States, having blown up its own cruiser main in the roadstead of Havana, attacks Spain, seizes Cuba, seizes the Philippines, and on the day the war begins, a director named Blackton shoots the first propaganda film in history, Tear Down the Spanish Flag. In fact, the plot of the film is the Spanish flag waving on the flagpole. The director's hand appears in the frame, tearing it down and replacing it with the stars and stripes. This was the first propaganda film, and 4 months later the first political film was shot, the prototype of all political films of the 30s, and it was shot by Georges Méliès, who is known as the father of special effects and the first cinema wizard, but he was also the father of political cinema. He made the film The Dreyfus Affair, clearly taking Dreyfus's side and himself playing Dreyfus's lawyer, who was shot shortly before the filming of this film. In 1913, at the Congress of Anarcho-Communists in Paris, a decision was made to create a cooperative people's cinema. This cooperative was very successful in producing films. In the 8 months before the First World War, they released 8 films, one of which, the film The Commune, also foreshadows the political cinema of the 60s. And if Kostya and the entire editorial staff, the entire publishing house hadn't put pressure on me, this book would have been at least 1.5 times thicker, because a lot of plot lines weren't included here. The book, the text is organized like a film, because there are a lot of flashbacks, digressions, flash forwards, close-ups, inserts, which tell about the future fate of one of the book's characters. A lot didn't make it in, including the fate of the leader of this People's Cinema Cooperative, the Spanish anarchist Armand Guerra, who would later return to Spain during the Civil War and film the amazing movie Meat for Predators there in 1937. It was amazing and revolutionary not because it was about revolution, but because for the first time in the history of cinema and in Catholic Spain, obscurantist Catholic Spain, I would say, a film was shot in which the main character walks around naked the entire film. This is also a very interesting story. This film. It simply did not fit here. One of the actresses who played the main role was shot by the Republicans a month later, and the second was eaten by lions. She was indeed eaten by lions in Marseille. All of this is not included here, but many other stories, other destinies are included. There are stories about Iran, about the Palestine Liberation Organization, and about the terrible fate of the Palestinian intelligentsia, which Yasser Arafat sent to all the capitals of the world in order to engage world directors and artists in defense of Palestine. They all died. They were all killed by the Israeli secret services. Most of it is about Chile and Argentina, partly Brazil. Here we are talking about new genres that were born in the process of this world revolution. For example, the film adaptation of Karl Marx, and in general, film adaptations of philosophical literature, from Guy Debord to Egyptian Marxist economists who wrote under a collective pseudonym. This is also a separate story, which I only partially touched on, because in 1927 Eisenstein told Stalin at a meeting that he was going to fill Marx's Capital. Stalin exclaimed, "You've gone mad." Such a reaction, uncharacteristic for Stalin, it really did slip out of him. He was usually good at hiding his emotions. Stalin, who could obviously imagine a lot, could already see the Dnieper hydroelectric power station, Stalingrad, and Gagarin in 1927, but he could not imagine a film adaptation of Marx. This was beyond the understanding of a person of the 1920s. In this situation, Stalin acted not as a master of time, but as a man of his time. Well, in the 60s, Eisenstein's dream came true. There were several film adaptations of Marx, and a wide variety of film genres appeared, many of which we have even forgotten. For example, when the Argentine guerrillas kidnapped someone in the early 70s, they sent a film letter from the underground, and these were not the modern vulgar jihadist videos where a man with a beat sits and says that we will blow everyone up. These were 15, 20, 30-minute full-length documentaries shot by the best Argentine directors of those years. Jorge Cedron, Raimondo Glaze, they will all die in the 70s. These were documentaries that explained in detail why they kidnapped, say, the honorary British consul, or why they shot the Home Secretary. It is hard to imagine now how, in the conditions of guerrilla, units of urban underground, people not only shot such communiques, which is already a feat, but also full-length feature films were shot by the same Argentines. Or how, for example, Miguel Litin, an outstanding Chilean director who miraculously escaped execution on September 11, 1973, managed to return, having changed his appearance under a false name to Pinochet's Chile, and not just return, but arrived there synchronously with two similarly camouflaged film crews. Over the course of several weeks, shoot underground full-length documentaries about Chile, which will then be seen around the world. It's hard to believe, really. Most of the events described in this book are somehow hard to believe, because it's hard to imagine such commitment and such dedication, such courage of the filmmakers. Probably all this can be defined by one word: passion. It was passion. passion for revolution, which led to the emergence of this unique continent, now forgotten and slandered. Revolutionary cinema, red cinema, international cinema. But it was all like that. I hope that many more, no less amazing, but instructive stories, which were not included in this book, will be included in some subsequent volumes. If this edition is sold out, we will publish a second edition, supplemented. Naturally, I have Napoleonic plans. How can they not be Napoleonic for a person who holds this in his hands? What is the print run? 1000 copies. But we have joint plans for a book about the so-called McCarthyism. Although Senator McCarthy had nothing to do with these events. He was not involved in Hollywood at all. McCarthyism is what we call in America Red Scare, Red Panic and Red Hysteria. That is, the hunt for red witches, which lasted for years and decades. I would like to write about this, and there was already a large publication in Science. And it is very interesting, of course, to write about French cinema during the occupation, and about French fascism and cinema, about the collaboration of French cinema with the Germans, and about the purges that French cinema was subjected to after the liberation. There are also subjects about which books have not been written, and which I have not dealt with, which I have touched upon somehow by accident, and in which I am not competent. This is the cinema of the Spanish Republic, the cinema of the Spanish War, and more broadly, this is the cinema of the proletarian and workers' film and photo leagues, which in the 20s and 30s were not just created, but also created by the Comintern. The Comintern, or rather the great Comintern propagandist Willy Münzenberg, set up colossal production all over the world, from Hollywood to Japan and Korea. When Münzenberg broke with Stalin in 1937, as some Comintern veterans believe, he became a more dangerous person for Stalin than Trotsky. There are no major, final works on this in the world either. In general, indeed, the political history of cinema, in my opinion, is one of the most interesting and relevant options for film studies and historiography of cinema. People usually ask, what is the relevance? Why do we need this book? Firstly, it is very interesting in what situations our compatriots appear here, how chivalrous and noble Roman Carmen behaves in Vietnam, and how vilely Solzhenitsyn behaves, who at the time of the most brutal murders of the Chilean intelligentsia tells on French television what a humanist and what a democrat General Pinochet is. This is truly a terrible stain on his conscience. Quite unexpectedly, some new things came to my mind even when I was rereading this book. I understand that this sounds idiotic. I read it, learned a lot of interesting things, but when snipers appeared on the Kiev Maidan on the morning of February 20th, I suddenly realized that this situation was described in my book, that the first time exactly the same snipers, whom no one could find later, and who shot at boss, were used in South America. This technology was tested in Argentina in June 1973, when such snipers shot a crowd. That is, snipers do not shoot a crowd. They intimidate, brutalize. Snipers are not there to shoot up a demonstration. They are there to create a psychological effect. The same snipers were shooting in Buenos Aires at people who came out to greet President Perón. September 11th, 1973. I have a pretty big piece there about September 11th, the day of Pinochet's coup. The same snipers shot at soldiers and supporters of Allende in Santiago. Nobody remembers this now, but Victor Jara's death was blamed on unknown snipers who shot at everyone. And only because Victor Jara was killed in front of hundreds of people at the stadium, and because of the courage of his wife, who found his body and found witnesses, Pinochet had to forget about snipers. This technology was first used there. there, before the overthrow of Ceausescu and before Moscow in 1993. This is a kind of know-how of the structures that have been known since the 70s as stay behind. This is an armed underground, deeply conspiratorial, which since the end of the 40s was created by NATO special services all over the world, primarily in Western Europe in case of Soviet occupation. Sometimes this underground became active, as in Italy in the 70s. For example, when absolutely clear traces of this underground were found in the street war that was unleashed in Italy between the Red and Black Brigades. These are the years when Pier Paolo Pasolini was killed, and when a very fashionable young actor wunderkind with the beautiful name of Fioravanti planted a bomb at the Bologna train station that killed 85 people. That is, in Italy, too, the people of cinema, in accordance with Italian passion, found themselves on both sides of this street war. Since a certain period in world history, which is discussed in this book, has not ended. I think that not only from the point of view of cinema, but from the point of view of reminding us of the historical events of the second half of the 20th century. It has not lost any of its relevance and seriousness. Well, what else can you say about a book whose index includes 2,500 names, 900 films, and where, as I said, the action takes place in West Berlin, where the Red Army faction of Ulrike Meinhof, a journalist and screenwriter, emerges. By the way, there were also several actors and directors in the FRG who were members of the RAF. Most of them died. The action takes place in Algeria and elsewhere, and in Guinea, where President Sékou Touré goes crazy and shoots up all Guinean cinema, and a little bit in Cambodia under the Khmer Rouge. And there is even one special greeting to the biographer of Kim Il-sung, who is present here in the hall, a very unusual episode connected with North Korea. The episode is dated 58-59 years. Kim Il-sung appears in this episode as a man who in every way welcomes and invites French filmmakers to North Korea, and dreams of breaking through North Korea's isolation by filming the first, and so far last, the only joint film in history with a capitalist country. The people who are working on this film are, by the way, not the last people in French cinema. Chris Marker, the great cinematographer, Armand Gauthier, the famous theater director and later film director, Claude Lanzmann, a journalist, then Sartre's secretary, and not yet an ardent Zionist, but an ardent communist. And indeed, in North Korea, they are filming a stunning movie called Maranbon with 100,000 extras. This is a traditional Korean melodrama, transferred to the times of the Korean War, and every scene would be great, but the French film crew takes this film to Paris to develop it, and when they finish the film is banned in France. It was first shown only 2 or 3 years ago, and in North Korea they first saw it only 2 or 3 years ago, but it was a truly unique experience of joint film production between Kim Il-sung and Chris Marker. So to speak, well, that's probably all I can say. It's hard to summarize the meaning of this book more briefly than I did, but this book is about passion, about rage, about cinema as war, about cinema as revolution. And also, I quote a very good phrase, said by a very bad person, but at that time he had not yet become a bad person. This was said in 1942, before he had yet become a snitch, by George Orwell, who was then still a decent person. He said, "We must constantly remind that everywhere in the 20th century, no matter how much the Reds were outrageous, the Whites were outrageous much more monstrously than them. I think that in the era of some kind of madness, these are things that also need to be talked about. Although it is not fashionable. However, in 1942 George Orwell also said about this. We need to talk about this. Although it is not fashionable. A few words about the film that will be shown. A film by Koji Wakamatsu, a Japanese classic. Unfortunately, he died 2 years ago, hit by a taxi in his favorite Tokyo neighborhood of Shinjuku, where he began his film career as a yakuza who looked after several bars. About a film career, this is not a joke, because in Japan it is a tradition. I don't know how it is now. But it was. When a movie is filmed on the streets, the director must approach the Yakuza who controls the area and ask for permission and pay a tax. Koji Wakamatsu was a Yakuza who became friend with several directors during his criminal practice. And when he was kicked out of the Yakuza, he was kicked out of everything. From school to culinary college, he decided that he would become a director. He went to television and there, naturally, remembering the circumstances under which they met this guy, they immediately gave him a production. He became an outstanding, truly one of the best Japanese directors. He was close in the late 60s, early 70s, to put it mildly, close, like Masao Adachi, like partly Nagisa Oshima, to the circle from which the Japanese Red Army emerged, the organization of urban guerrillas, considered in the early 70s the most ubiquitous, although there were very few of them, these fighters, and the most ruthless, first of all, in relation to herself. Wakamatsu was arrested several times, and in the film you will see there is an organization called the Seasons. Its members have pseudonyms, days of the week, months and seasons. Auguste Blanqui had such a structure in the 1830s. There was such an organization called the Society of the Seasons. This film, like all of Wakamatsu's films, he made several films about a certain terrorist underground, sex terror and the ecstasy of the angels. This film turned out to be prosthetic, because it is about an underground organization that is not so much fighting its class enemies, the outside world, as it is mired in an internal struggle, in internal violence of a sadomasochistic nature rather than political.
Воюет со своими классовыми врагами, с внешним миром, сколько погрязла во внутренней борьбе, во внутреннем насилии уже такого садомазохистского свойства более чем политического.
When Wakamatsu was filming this movie, he started filming it in the fall of 71, and in December 71, 26 members of the armed underground went on vacation to a cabin in the mountains. In order to improve their theoretical Marxist-Leninist training, they decided to hold self-criticism sessions there. Self-criticism was a traditional Maoist pastime. It usually did not result in death, but as a result of this self-criticism, out of 26 Japanese Red Army soldiers, they killed 14 in 3 weeks. They would have killed each other to the end. The rest would have committed suicide, but 2 of them went away for some secret purpose to the railway station, where they were arrested. People who participated in these theoretical studies are still sitting in prisons in Japan.
По какой-то конспиративной надобности на железнодорожную станцию, где их и взяли. До сих пор сидят люди в Японии в тюрьме, которые участвовали в этих теоретических занятиях.
Wakamatsu, of course, didn't know about this yet, and among others, the girl who was in charge of distributing his previous films died in this house. The film was released literally a few days after this mountain nightmare became known to Japan. There was also a siege of the hotel, because several Red Army soldiers captured the hotel and fought off the police for a very long time. This film was obstructed, if not boycotted, in Japan. How can you make such a film at a time when all of Japan learned of such horrific events? But the beauty of the situation is that Wakamatsu made this film before, and he predicted this internal spiral of violence that dragged his friends to the bottom. Wakamatsu ended his life, as I said, 2 years ago. He died in his last years as a director whose films represented Japan at the Berlin Film Festival, and in Locarno, and in Venice, and in Cannes, and yet he was periodically arrested because he was still a bandit from the Japanese Red Army in the eyes of Japanese law enforcement. This is truly one of the masterpieces of political cinema. Or rather, it is a film made politically, because there was such a dichotomy. The most radical film directors said, political cinema is cinema that talks about politics, and even if it speaks from the right, revolutionary revolutionary positions, but still this film uses bourgeois structures, the structures of melodrama, the structures of thriller. Therefore, it is still a bourgeois trick. We need to make not political films, but we need to make films politically. Wakamatsu was just one of those people who, like Godard in his Maoist period, or René Vautier during the Algerian War, one of the heroes of my book, and many people in the 60s, made political films. What's also funny, why did Wakamatsu make films so freely? He was listed in the ghetto of pink cinema, porn cinema, which made up 80% of Japanese film production in the late 60s. There, directors enjoyed absolute freedom of action. If there was a necessary amount of sex and violence in the film, then the rest of the time they could do whatever they wanted, even read Karl Marx from the screen. And that's it. Japanese leftist directors took advantage of this. I told you about Ecstasy of the Angels, a film by Koji Wakamatsu from 1972.
Фильм 1972 года Кодзи Вакамацу и
In order not to bore you with more chatter, if someone wants to ask me something, I will gladly answer if I can. There are apparently no questions. Everything was convincing.
Сожги улицы на рассвете.